Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
Good afternoon, friends and countrymen.
Good afternoon.
Gentlemen and ladies, I am very deeply honored and very much humbled to have this opportunity to address you. It has now been 18 years since I was last in Williamsburg City, that being when the capital relocated to Richmond Town back in 1780. And I'm delighted to see that despite the relocation of the capital and the current national crisis we're undergoing, it appears that Williamsburg is still most prosperous and flourishing indeed. It is good to see you all. Why, I dare say, sir, it's been at least 25 years since you and I last laid eyes upon each other. You're looking very well, as is your daughter beside you. For those of you who are not yet known to me, my name is Henry, Patrick Henry Jr., Esquire, your most humble and obedient servant to command. What brings me here upon this particular occasion is I am soon to meet, in about an hour's time, with two of your fellow townsmen, the Reverend Mr. Robert Andrews, there at the College of William and Mary, and Mr. St. George Tucker, who resides here upon the back street. Both of these worthy gentlemen have expressed an interest into entering into a partnership with me concerning the purchase of a 6,000-acre tract of land in Norfolk County, a 2.5-day ride to the south and east of here, from which I am just now returned. 'Tis an area that the local inhabitants know as the Green Sea. They call it such because it's swampland, and within it grow very tall, thick green grasses. And when the wind blows off the bay, the grasses move in such a fashion as this, giving every appearance of being waves upon a green ocean. My intention with this particular property is to drain the waters of the swamp, for underneath is the blackest and sandiest soil I have ever seen, ideally suited for the cultivation of sweet-scented Chesapeake tobacco, that which fetches the highest price on the world exchange. The Frenchies love it. So it is business rather than public service that has my return to Williamsburg. Would it offend you terribly if I had a seat upon this bench? You see, I recently slipped and fell from my riding chair, and my legs are still not quite my own. I thank you for your kind consideration. Williamsburg, the birthplace of American liberty. I spent about a third of my life either coming to or leaving from Williamsburg. Indeed, I lived amongst you here in the late 70s when I was serving as governor there at the Palace Green. The first time that I came to Williamsburg was back in 1760 to receive my law certificate. I did not set out in life to become an attorney. In fact, my father desired that my brother William and I first become shopkeepers and then later tobacco merchants. Alas, two different attempts at a country store both failed. And not, as my detractors would have you believe, because I'm more given to invective than to inventory. Those were very difficult years throughout the Old Dominion. Well, you recall, sir, there were 3 consecutive years of drought in the middle 50s. Tobacco failed miserably. And as tobacco is our money, why a great many enterprises were not successful. If anything, my brother and I were simply guilty of being overly generous in extending credit towards our neighbors, who otherwise must have starved. But to further complicate matters for me in my early life, and I did marry rather young by most Virginian standards. I was but 18, my dear Sally, now deceased, only 16. Our fathers were initially opposed to the union, for after all, I'd not yet made anything of myself. I was a failed storekeeper, for heaven's sake. But they finally relented, and upon our nuptials we were granted 300 acres of land in Hanover County at Pine Slash, and 6 very young, inexperienced Negro slaves. The farm was never productive from the start, owing no doubt to previous years of planting tobacco in that particular parcel. It's a miserable plant in that regard. One can have an excellent stand of tobacco for perhaps 2 generations, but after that the soil has been completely depleted or exhausted of all of its goodness and fertility. And then to further complicate our woes, our farmhouse burned, and almost all of our possessions with it when the roof collapsed the following morning. So just to have some shelter above my family's heads, we had 2 small children at that time, In exchange for a private room at my father-in-law's tavern, Hanover Tavern, I began to work for him, managing the premises in his absences, keeping the bar, playing at fiddle, even, if that was required. Hanover Tavern sits just opposite the road from Hanover Courthouse, and thus in this way I became rather quickly acquainted with many of the lawyers who were riding the county circuit. That is to say, by day they would argue law in the courthouse, and by night would argue more loudly in the tavern. And after a time I began to think that I too might be well suited to that particular occupation, for my mother claimed until her passing that I have a gift from God for argument. So I borrowed as many law books as I could lay my hands upon, which was 3. Read them in 6 weeks' time when I made that fateful journey here to Williamsburg to stand for my examinations. Thus, you see, I did not follow the customary approach to the learning of the law. Most young men in those days, for we had no law school in America at the time, the chair of William and Mary was the first such chair, but most young men would read law with an established attorney, a mentor, and commonly for 4 to even 5 years before they dared to undertake their examinations. Not so with me. I was rather anxious to get some start in life. In order to become a licensed attorney in Virginia, one must undergo 2 very grueling, 3-hour-long oral examinations on the 4 different points of law. And those examinations are administered by the men who were certified to profess law in the general court, the supremest court in Virginia, the only which can hand down a sentence of death, which in those days, of course, was here in the Capitol building, at the top of the hill. So when I arrived, the first gentleman to whom I applied was Mr. Peyton Randolph, God rest his soul. He lived here upon the back street, would eventually become the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, and in fact ultimately was the first president of the first Grand Congress in Philadelphia City. In fact, he died while in that office back in '75. I explained to him that I had read law by myself, not with a mentor, in a rather short period of time, and I think my appearance may have had something to do with his reaction, for being from the back country as I am, I'm always most comfortable clad in greasy leather buckskin breeches and a hunting frock. I was all dusty from that long ride from Hanover. He promptly shut the door in my face. Not to be undone, I then applied to Mr. Robert Carter Nicholas, who would later become the treasurer of both the colony and the Commonwealth, and his reaction was much the same as Mr. Peyton Randolph's. At this point, I was becoming a little bit anxious, but with a little bit of assistance, I think, from my young friend, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was reading law with George Wythe there upon the Palace Green. I was able to gain entry to Mr. Wythe's home. He was suitably impressed with my legal arguments. With some reluctance, signed my certificate. One requires 2 signatures, and yet he made me first to promise that I would immediately return home and continue to read municipal law, as my knowledge of it was rather weak after such a short period of time of study. But armed with his signature, I was able to gain entry to Mr. John Randolph, the younger brother to Peyton. He was similarly impressed with my legal arguments. In fact, he paid to me a very great compliment that day. He said to me as he signed, "After this day, Mr. Henry, sir, I will never again trust to appearances." So I went home, and in short order became licensed in 4 different counties to the north and west of here. Louisa County, Hanover County, where I was living at the time, Goochland County, and Cumberland County, and I began to ride the county circuit. Here in Virginia, we deliberately stagger the dates that courts are open for business, so as to allow a young attorney to go from courthouse to courthouse. So in other words, the courthouse in Louisa meets the first Tuesday of each month, Hanover County, the adjacent county, the first Friday of each month, and so forth. And I was busy for those first 3 years of my practice, handling no less than 3,000 different legal matters, nothing of great import or significance, licenses, wills, deeds, petty disputes having to do with debt or boundaries or borders. But then, in December of 1763, came my big break, the Parsons Cause. Now, to refresh you, friends, in those days, under royal authority, all we had ever known was a state church, the Church of England, which, among other things, required all heads of household to pay an annual tithe, or a tax, to support the local Church of England parish and that one church alone. And much of those monies were applied to the salary of the established clergyman within that parish. Excuse me. And in those days, our clergy were living quite well. By law, they were receiving 16,000 pounds of tobacco per year in order to fulfill their ministerial responsibilities. Now, when translated into money, Tobacco in those days generally sold for 2 pence per pound. Thus, 16,000 pounds of tobacco would equal to 144 pounds Virginia current money. A gentleman's income. Make no mistake about it. Why, by contrast, I dare say that even today, these 35 years later, most of the storekeepers in Williamsburg are very happy to make 90 pounds in a year's time. So our clergy were living quite well. But because of that drought that I mentioned earlier, from 1755 to 58, there was a terribly short crop of tobacco. And because of the short crop, the price of tobacco tripled on the world exchange to 6 pence per pound. The House of Burgesses realized immediately that, oh my, if we continue to pay our clergy 16,000 pounds of tobacco a year, it's going to bankrupt our society. And so they passed a law known as the Two-Penny Act, which declared that for the time of that emergency only, our clergy and other public servants would not be paid in tobacco, but rather would be paid in money, and that they would be paid at the rate of 2 pence per pound, which tobacco had always sold for. In other words, they were making the same amount of income they always had. Well, one of them, the Reverend John Cam, commissary at the college, believed that he and his fellows were being cheated, and so he sailed to Great Britain and appealed before the King, the Privy Council, and the Board of Trade to have the Two-Penny Act nullified or overturned, which the King did. The Reverend Cam then returned to Virginia, spread the word amongst his fellow rapacious harpies, and they began to bring lawsuits against all of the vestries, as well as the sheriffs, our tax collectors, suing for damages in the amount of 288 pounds Virginia current money. The second time that this particular legal matter was heard had to do with the Reverend Mr. James Mowry of Fredericksville Parish in Louisa County, suing Thomas Johnson, the sheriff of Louisa, for 288 pounds. Mr. Johnson's initial hire of attorney resigned, thinking, there's no point to this. The King has nullified the Two-Penny Act. They're going to get everything they're asking for. It's just a waste of time. And so I was taken on as a last-minute afterthought. I found my gift that day. I harangued the jury for well more than an hour's time, painting the clergy in such a disgraceful, despicable, and greedy light that the jury was so horrified they retired for only a minute or two to the jury room before they returned with their verdict. They awarded the Reverend Mr. Mowry not 288 pounds, but only 1 penny in damages. That set a precedent. The courtroom at the time, by the way, was packed with clergymen from other parishes, no doubt eagerly awaiting to see what kind of money they could expect when their own lawsuits came about. But they realized very quickly on, after I was done with Mowry, that there was no way that they could win this one, at least not in the court of public opinion. And so they began to drop their lawsuits throughout the rest of Virginia. It was considered a great victory, especially for the small dirt farmer of the Old Dominion, which of course is the greatest part of our population then and now. And furthermore, it was a manner in which we defied the King to veto laws that we passed for our own protection and benefit. I approached the Reverend Mr. Mowry shortly after the verdict and apologized to him for some of the rough things I'd said about the clergy that day, but at the same time, with a wink, I said, but this case has made me famous. I was picked up upon the shoulders of a crowd of men and paraded around the courtyard electioneering style, and the following year I found myself elected for the first time into that pile of bricks at the top of the hill, the House of Burgesses, representing at first the good people of Louisa County. In retrospect, I do think that I had 2 advantages to my favor on that particular occasion. For one thing, the venue of the trial had changed. It was supposed to take place in Louisa County, but its courthouse had sustained a lightning strike the week before, and so was undergoing repairs. The venue then was changed to neighboring Hanover County, where I was born and raised, where my father, Colonel John Henry, happened to be the Chief Justice of the Hanover County Court. I suppose it also was to my advantage a bit that having been born and raised there, I knew that at least 8 of the jury members were Presbyterians, and not too terribly excited with the idea of having to pay an annual tax to support a church to which they themselves did not subscribe. Well, the following year I took my seat for the first time in the House. The year was 1765, the year of the hated Stamp Act. And almost immediately I ruffled a great many feathers here in Williamsburg by not adhering to the established traditions of the House. You know, a freshman Burgess is not supposed to cause any stir nor sensation. He's supposed to sit on the back bench on his hands, not speak, give his vote when and how he's told to do so by his betters. Well, I'd only sworn the oath of office for the first time 8 days before I introduced my Stamp Act resolutions, which, in the words of my worthy friend Jefferson, set the impetus to the ball of revolution a-rolling down the hill. There were a total of 7 of these resolves, and they increased in terms of their rather incendiary language, with the first 4 being nothing really new and rather tame, stating simply that the earliest adventurers and settlers who came here to the Old Dominion came with the same full rights, liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities as though they were born and residing within Great Britain, and that those rights and liberties would also transfer to their posterity, to their children. The 5th one drew some outrage from the more conservative and cool members of the House. It stated, matter-of-factly, that the House of Burgesses, therefore, has the sole and exclusive right and authority to lay taxes upon the people of Virginia. It passed by only 1 vote. My friend Jefferson was standing in the lobby at the time. He wasn't yet a member of the House, but he told me afterwards that right after that vote, Peyton Randolph himself stormed past him exclaiming, "By God, I'd give 500 guineas for a single vote this day." Well, based upon the reaction to the 5th, I knew there was no point in raising up or introducing 6 and 7, with the 7th and final resolution actually accusing the king himself of being an enemy to this, His Majesty's most sovereign colony of Virginia. So I went home. The following day, there was still a quorum in Williamsburg, and the 5th resolution was expunged from the official record. So, in point of fact, we only passed 4 of the 7 resolutions. However, by some miracle, as if by magic, all 7 resolutions appeared in newspapers to the far north as Rhode Island and to the far south as Savannah. You see, the effect of this was, it made the men of the House of Burgesses, and me personally, appear to be far bolder than we really were. But it got Americans talking for the first time with one collective voice. Oh, make no mistake, my friends. The British government had deliberately kept these colonies apart one from another because that way they knew that we were weak. But if we spoke with one voice, we could wield a formidable sword indeed. I would be returned to the House of Burgesses here in Williamsburg for the next 10 years, until the House of Burgesses was no more. I was honored to serve you at the first 2 sessions of the Grand Congress. I lived amongst you for a period of time in late '75, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Virginia Army, and of course served as the first governor of the Commonwealth from '76 to '79, living in that fine mansion there at the end of the green. I've not been back since, because in 1780, the following year after I left my office, and we have very strict limits upon the number of years a man can hold the office of governor. No more than 3 consecutive one-year terms, at which time he must stand down to private station for at least 4 years to remember from whence he came before he might hold the office of governor again. So when I stepped down from the executive office in '79, the capital moved to Richmond the following year, not been back since until this very day. And it is good to be back in this birthplace of American liberty. I will tell you though, my friends, I am very deeply concerned, worried, alarmed, one might say, about the future of our country. And I'm not the only one. I just recently received a letter from my old friend, President George Washington, who reminded me of some of the terrible crises that we have suffered under in these last 10 years since we established the federal system of government. He reminded me, for example, that there was a terrible disease that spread throughout many of our cities, the yellow fever, a plague that literally decimated the city of Philadelphia That is 1/10 of the populace died as a result of this terrible disease. The Congress and President Washington, of course, were there, it being the national capital, and evacuated along with half of the other population. A disease that has no cure that we know of, and it spreads. Didn't come here to Williamsburg, but so close as Alexandria, just a 4-day ride to the north and west of here. He reminded me of the fact that we have seen 2 armed rebellions in this country. The Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, where armed federal troops behind General Washington himself in uniform were on the field of battle against armed American citizens having to do with taxes imposed upon them by the federal system of government. He reminded me of the fact of these democratical societies which have been springing up all over the countryside. They're in effect Frenchmen who are doing everything they can to undermine whichever administration might be in office at the time, both for Washington and now for President Adams, in favor of the French government. He reminded me of the fact that our trade is in terrible, dire straits from pirates for the most part. When the administration in the federal city appears to be more friendly towards the English government, they're French pirates. When we appear to be more friendly towards the French government, they're English pirates. And then, of course, there are those monsters on the Barbary Coast in the Mediterranean who are not only stealing our cargoes and our vessels, but selling American seamen into slavery. Because of the democratical societies, the Adams administration has seen fit to impose the Alien and Sedition laws, which are contrary to everything that we struggled against Great Britain about. Throwing a man in jail for expressing his opinion in his own newspaper, for example. And because of the Alien and Sedition laws, we now have Messrs. Jefferson and Madison penning, respectively, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, in effect saying, you know, we've changed our minds about this national government. We've decided that if Congress enacts a law that we don't like, we don't have to abide by it. We can nullify it. That's nowhere in the Constitution, as I pointed out to them 10 years ago. And now we have New York and Massachusetts both threatening secession. In short, my friends, President Washington and I are very deeply concerned that we are on the verge of disunion. And the purpose of his letter was to me was, he said, I know that you won't consider standing for nomination to any federal office. You've refused so many already. But will you at least do this? Will you at least submit your name for nomination to the Virginia Assembly and use the reverence and the affection that the people of Virginia still have for you to keep Virginia in the Union? For as Virginia goes, so goes the Union. Well, I've been thinking about it over these past few days on my journey here from the Green Sea. Even though I'm happily retired and with one foot in the grave, nonetheless I believe that my children would blush were they to know that General Washington and I were contemporaries, and that yet I refused his request for me to throw in my mile for the public good. It's time for me once again, I believe, to put my actions where my words are. In fact, I was reminded of the first day of the very first Congress in the fall of 1774. It was rather awkward. Here we all were gathered together in Carpenter's Hall, never having met one another. I'd never met a New England man ever before that day, all of us so vastly different one from another. And finally, one of the gentlemen from New Hampshire, Bartlett, I believe, raised up his hand and said, well, gentlemen, we've come all the way to Philadelphia. I suppose we should accomplish something. How, for example, are we going to arrive at decisions? Are we going to vote? And if we do, are we all going to have equal voice? Or will Virginia, the wealthiest and the most populous of us all, have greater influence than, say, little Rhode Island? And that's when the bickering and the squabbling began. The petty jealousies for all to see exposed. And finally, fearful that we were going to disband before we got anything at all accomplished, I desired to be recognized, took to the floor and raised a great many eyebrows when I said this: gentlemen, government is dissolved. A time of crisis is clearly now at hand. Fleets and armies come to our shores, clear evidence of this crisis. All distinctions now must therefore be thrown down. The distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders is no more. I am not a Virginian. I am an American. I believe the time has come that we should once again reconsider those very sentiments. Let us not split into factions which must destroy this union upon which our very existence hangs. My friends, let us save our strength for the English the French, the Germans, and not exhausted in civil commotions. Reflecting back to the first motto of the first Congress, united we stand, divided we most certainly fall. Well, I've prattled on long enough, I suppose, about my participation in Williamsburg over these last few years. It occurs to me that there might be a question or two from some of my hearers, or a comment for that matter. If that be the case, may I respectfully propose, for purposes of order, that you first raise up your hands and be recognized. Yes, madam, I pray you.
What is your position on the federal authority versus the state authority?
I thank the lady for her penetrating question. That being, what is my personal opinion with regard to federal authority versus state authority? You must know that 10 years ago, in 1788, when the question was put before the Constitutional Convention in Richmond Town in June 1788, I was the most vigorous opponent of Virginia ratifying that particular plan. To give you an idea as to how vigorous my opposition of that scheme was, the ratifying convention lasted a total of 23 days. I spoke for almost all of 17 of those days. And the idea to me then was that the idea of Virginia surrendering her sovereignty as well as her preeminence to a body of men, the majority of whom have nothing in common with us, was absurd. And yet at the same time, a slight majority of my fellow Virginians did embrace that particular plan. It was a slim majority. Final vote here in Virginia was 89 to 79, and we became the 10th state to ratify the Constitution of these United States. You may call me what you will, but I am a strict constitutionalist, and I am also a true Republican. That's with a small letter R, not a capital one. I despise the idea of political factions. But a Republican submits to the will of the majority. And so at that time, at the final vote, I declared that I would resolve to be the most peaceable of all United States citizens, and so I have certainly endeavored to be. We do, of course, have that list of amendments that came with the first Congress in '91. And that was my chiefest fault with the federal system of government, was that there was not a Bill of Rights. But the 10th Amendment to the Constitution assures that all of those powers not spelled out in the Constitution to the federal government are retained by the states. But knowing the nature of man and the nature of government as I do, having spent so many years in public service, we, the citizens, must always be vigilant, because the federal government is going to try to insert themselves into our own states' rights procedures. Have a care. And if it ever happens, who do we blame for it? Ourselves. I hope that satisfies your question, madam. Please, sir.
Question. I heard a number of years ago you gave a speech which closed with the line, "Give me liberty or give me death,"
Yes.
up in Richmond. Can you tell me, because I don't know, what was some of the context around that speech, and what were some of the points in that speech, because I only know your closing line.
I thank the gentleman who wonders about a speech or an oration I made back in 1775 in Richmond Town, which concluded with an expression that became a battle cry shortly thereafter, that being liberty or death. The circumstances were these. In 1773, there was a great quantity of East India tea which was thrown overboard a number of ships, 3 ships, in the harbor at Boston. And the reaction of the British government was to punish every man, woman, and child in the city of Boston especially, but the entire colony of Massachusetts, with a series of intolerable acts. And perhaps the most offensive of those intolerable or coercive acts was the Boston Port Bill, which decreed that on a given day, the 1st of June, 1774 to be precise, the port of Boston was going to be sealed off by the British Navy, allowing nothing in nor out, which obviously was going to cause a great deal of misery to the many thousands of innocents within Boston who had nothing at all to do whatever with the destruction of all that tea. Well, here in Williamsburg, when we heard of what was about to occur to our countrymen up there, we resolved for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer to show our support and our sympathy for those distressed souls in Massachusetts Bay. The reaction of our royal governor at the time, the last royal governor, Lord Dunmore, was to dissolve the House of Burgesses. He had that prerogative. And we never met again as a colonial legislature. We did, however, meet in a series of conventions. There were a total of 5 of them, with the 5th and final meeting here in the Capitol building to declare Virginia's independence, write our Declaration of Rights, and to form our new Republican system of government. The first convention also met here in Williamsburg because Lord Dunmore was away to the west. He was fighting Indians at the time in Dunmore's War, as it's now called. So the cat was away, and the purpose of the first convention was very simple, to elect a delegation of men to go to Philadelphia to sit at the First Congress and to formulate their instructions. While in Philadelphia, we realized we're going to have to meet again up here to see how well are going our efforts towards a peaceful settlement with our mother country. So that required a second convention. Lord Dunmore was back, and so to put some goodly distance betwixt ourselves and His Excellency, we decided to have this convention in Richmond Town, in the only building large enough to accommodate the 120 men in attendance, that being the town church, Henrico Parish, as it's currently officially known, which perhaps in another 30 years from now will be renamed St. John's Episcopal Church. Even though no blood had yet been spilled, I knew it was coming. Most men believed that we were going to peacefully settle our differences with our king, that he was still our loving parent, our protector, and yet I knew otherwise, based upon all these fleets and armies that were creeping in to various reaches of North America. I also could not help but observe that we were woefully unprepared to defend ourselves against an invasion of redcoats and Marines. And so I introduced a resolution on the 23rd of March, 1775, calling for the formation of independent companies of gentlemen volunteers. All armed, all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 to be under arms, trained to arms, and ready to march at a moment's notice. There was a great deal of offense taken to my resolution, coming largely from these Eastern aristocrats here in the Tidewater. In effect, their argument being this: "Please, Mr. Henry, we seek peace, sir, not war. Your scheme is not the way to go about a peaceful solution, quite the contrary. If we form up these independent companies you're proposing, the British government is certainly going to view that as a hostile or aggressive action. And rather than keeping this invasion you're predicting at bay, you'll be inviting them here. You'll be asking them to do the terrible things to us here in Virginia as they already are in Massachusetts. Peace, Mr. Henry, peace. And furthermore, sir, have you lost your senses? We are far too weak to give any consideration to contesting the might of the great British lion." Well, as I looked about the town church from the third pew, I became increasingly alarmed that these very eloquent and influential gentlemen had successfully persuaded a majority to vote against my resolution, thus continuing us in this defenseless state. That's when I desired to be recognized, took to the floor, and I did indeed deliver forth quite a few more words than future generations might realize. In the interest of brevity, for I do have an important business meeting quite soon, I'll not give the whole, but near the conclusion is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, glaring at my opposition. But as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. One eyewitness swore that he could see fragments of iron flying through the air. And then I sat down. Well, it was effective, but again, it was very close. Out of 120 men in attendance, my resolution was approved by only a margin of 5 votes. Believe it or not, in 17 and 75, as a country, we're almost evenly divided into halves. We'll never see that day again, will we? And word did spread like a wildfire. Shortly thereafter, there were a number of not only Virginia soldiers, but soldiers to the far north as Rhode Island who were still sewing or stitching "Liberty or Death" upon the breasts of their hunting shirts, adopting it as their battle cry. And sure enough, as many of the predictions that I made within the course of that oration as to what we could expect the British government to do based upon past interventions, they came true. Some of them within just 3 weeks' time after that date. Another sentence from that particular oration that might be of interest to some of my hearers today is, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future, but by the past." In other words, for our young hearers here, that's why we study history, so we can know the future. Things never change. Man never changes. Please, my dear. I could not quite hear you.
What part of your life made you most proud?
Oh, what part of my life has made me most proud? Well, I am certainly very proud of my contributions to the cause of liberty and in this bold experiment we call America. But without doubt, that which makes me most proud is my beloved family. I have fathered 17 children altogether, though I have outlived 6 of them. I have currently 77 grandchildren. So I ask you, friends, who's the father of this country? It's clearly my family, my dear, and that, I believe, is as it should be. I thank you all for your attendance. I am informed by my trusted manservant 'tis time for me to take my meeting. I would that I could meet with each of you severally. God save you, the rights and liberties of America, and the fighting men in the field.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.